Thank you, Vrinda. Uh, I've been speaking so much, and thanks for water here already. Uh, but yeah, I'm going to be asking questions now, so the tables have turned. This conversation, this panel is going to be really with a lens of grassroots organization asking the big funders, data measurement ऐसे क्यों करते हो और ऐसे क्यों नहीं करते हो? Why do you measure data like that and not like that? Or are there best practices that you guys have evolved that we need to learn from? Instead of calling out people in terms of monitoring versus evaluation, or monitoring evaluation in a participatory framework of doing things versus in a funder-led framework of doing things, we're going to be calling them in with love, like Deep beautifully, set the context alive this morning. We will not be called as an NGO or a funder, we'll not call out on each other that why this was not set right, but calling people in with love and closing the piece as well. So a lot of conversation is going to happen with Rohit, Shri, and Paige, and bringing in perspectives as diverse as monitoring, evaluation, and the third big monster, learning, in the entire piece. How do we, if I can start with you, Antra, because you bring in a perspective, Shri, sorry, you bring in a perspective from the Antra, foundation, both wearing the grassroots organization founder hat and now a grant maker hat, right? Like somebody in the morning was also mentioning. How do you bring in this perspective where, is there a way where we can design monitoring and evaluation to measure empathy? And I've written this down because I didn't want to miss out on any piece here. How do we design M&E to measure empathy, participatory democracies powered by feminist politics, caste and gender as intersectionalities, mental health, care gap, equity, and so on, well-being, if you may. And if you can give specific examples, there's this conversation always around whether M&E is anecdotal or whether M&E should be data-led. How do you then, if it's data-led, how do you then measure the hurt and the wounds and the oppression and equity and the care and the well-being pieces that will always get missed out because randomized control trials don't always work to measure this, right?
Sorry, how many minutes do I have to answer?
You can take 4 minutes.
So thanks, Sonal. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to share this space here. We've spent a lot of time talking about words like trust-based philanthropy and participatory grant-making, MLE, participatory MLE, impact measurement, theory of change. And I think most nonprofits and foundations and philanthropy would be in violent agreement that they want to do this stuff. So I think everybody directionally believes in these principles. And then you get to a table with a nonprofit and a funder, and we are stumped because you don't know how to operationalize those principles. And so that's the lens I come from. I will have very few answers to those questions, but my learning agenda is, how does one get pragmatic? I'm unapologetically pragmatic about this because the principles are fine, but eventually there is a power dynamic, there is history, you've got to operationalize all of this stuff into a grant or a funding relationship. Even a trust-based relationship has to start on day one with two parties who don't know each other. They're just dating, they're just getting to know each other, right? And so my learning agenda is, how do we take all these questions, all these principles, and translate them into something that works for both the parties? That being said, I will try and tee up a couple of questions that we grapple with, which hopefully answer some of the points you're asking about. Many organizations have these amazing mission, vision statements on one side. Then on the other side, you have impact that you want to achieve. In the middle is that messy input, activity, output framework. And that's where we really have to get into conversations. And how do you unbundle that word impact? I mean, it's hard enough doing impact when you're talking very tangible stuff like, say, schools or vaccinations, immunizations, stuff like that. And you are actually teeing up stuff that is a little more intangible, like things on advocacy, trust, gender, equity. So going from lofty missions to impact, unbundling impact, that word in the middle is one thing I think we really need to participate with the nonprofit. So I truly believe, and this is something we like to do, I ask the organization across the table, please tell me, how would you know you have been successful? Right, in 5 years or 10 years down the line, what would you like to see? And I think that's the starting point of the conversation. The second question we grapple with is this entire MLE thing. I mean, all businesses need to measure input, activity, output. I mean, and a nonprofit should be no different. It's just that the way we measure it and the metrics may be different. But each of those things, M, L, and E, has a different burden of proof and how you go about it. So monitoring, for example, should be straightforward. If you're a school, how many kids show up, how many teachers, how many kids graduated, what are the dropout rates, but that's just data. It's of no use. And then that data has to be translated into something actionable, which is where learning comes in. If I see dropout increasing 3 years in a row, I want to ask myself as a program, why? And what do I do about it? Right? That's when it becomes actionable. And eventually, evaluations, when you step back, either individually or within the organization or with an external facilitator, and you ask, did we do what we thought we were going to do? And that's evaluation. The reality is you need all of that. It doesn't matter what kind of trust-based philanthropy it is. We need all of that, which brings me to the third question we grapple with. So much of this dynamic is this us versus them, right? The funder is telling us to do this, and I hate it, right? I ask the question, wouldn't I as a program want to know answers to those exact same questions to make my program better? And so if we can figure out how to craft this language where it's like win-win, both of us want to know answers to those questions, and how do we make it happen? And to do that, finally, that's the pragmatist in me, you need to fund it. Everybody wants MLE, nobody wants to fund it. And as a result, people are chasing the program and executing the program, funders don't want to fund it becomes under-resourced, and this is just a hypothesis. I think trust-based philanthropy is going to make it even harder, because we're taking away stuff that is tangible, that we can measure, putting in place principles that we can't yet measure, and I don't quite know what everyone wants to do about it. Anyway, I'll stop there, and I'm not sure if I answered all your questions, but these are just more questions to add to what you had.
You know, what I loved about what you said, Shri, was also this piece that's not us versus them, but really like it being together, and the human connectedness piece that I again will pick from what Deep said in the morning. And the reason I ask you, you know, how there's a lot of conversation that started happening in the last 2-3 years about how do we design for scale, how do we build scale in the beginning of the program. But who's talking about how do we design for equity and well-being, right? Lobo spoke about it in the morning when, you know, that he's saying that, yeah, design for, or ask me money for your team's well-being, right? But how many times are we beginning to evaluate that? And I'll share this little story from the spaces where, you know, we work on the ground. So there is this girl called Choti. Like I said, you know, the names are Choti, Antim, Kafi, basically a symbolism of you're enough, you were never needed, you're small, and so on and so forth. And this child, who's 8, no mom, the mother had moved, you know, was trafficked to Punjab and killed along the way and all of that. And father, a very loving, doting father, but is a dihadi mazdoor, is a construction worker. So this Choti stays with the Chachaji, the paternal grandfather. There's a reason why I narrate the story in the MLE platform today. And the Chacha says, so he spits on the floor or on the wall and asks Choti to lick it. And only if you do, you can go to Protsahan to get your whatever, you know, studies and things that you want to do at the center. And a lot of times, you know, the amount of home visits increase, the amount of, you know, psychosocial first aid counseling to this child and her family increases, bringing the father in the conversation increases. And although we may say the number of home visits, because it's still a more tangible way of looking at it, how do you account for that hurt and the childhood trauma that gets into, and sometimes maybe the crisis intervention officer who's on the ground directly will be able to narrate the story, but will the story be passed down even within the organization to come on the final report is really what we you know, kind of deal with, struggle with as a tension as a smaller nonprofit. And that brings me to you, Rohit. In terms of, you know, there's always this lot of tension, and Shri kind of, sorry, I just constantly keep saying Antra. This conversation that you kind of left the threads on, right? There is this trust-based philanthropy piece, you know, especially after the McKinsey Scots and all of that has happened in the last few years, at least in the spotlight, has been happening for quite some bit. There's always this little tension between, that I feel in my head as a grassroots nonprofit, between the trust-based philanthropy pieces that say, hey, okay, don't give us reports, and the basic MLE premises that Sri spoke about. Is there a middle path that you've been able to at least begin conversations on or analyze at Bridgespan?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And before I answer that question, I want to first just congratulate Dasra on the Rebuild India Fund. I've spent the whole day just sort of sitting here and basking and being inspired by all the various folks who've come up on the stage and who have had a chance to connect with. Really remarkable work. I think one of the biggest tensions you have with the concept of trust-based philanthropy is that people have internalized a very particular form of trust-based philanthropy and decided that that's it. And that is what I would call windfall philanthropy, where a nonprofit is sitting, you're sitting quietly in your office in Jharkhand or in Detroit, and the phone rings, and someone says, congratulations, I'd like to give you $5 million. And there are philanthropists who operate like that, and then they walk away, and they have very few requirements associated with reporting, and that's that's been largely the discourse I've heard today about when we talk about trust-based philanthropy. But I would like you all, and I think we believe that there's a huge spectrum of what trust-based philanthropy looks like. And so the first thing we want to establish very clearly is that trust-based philanthropy does not represent an absence of rigor or an absence of expectations. It does not preclude relationships, communication, conversation. And so while we all love the idea of the windfall philanthropy, and I think it has an important role, there's an opportunity to think about trust-based philanthropy as not so much stepping away from rigor, stepping away from accountability, but thinking about, to Lobo's point earlier today, whose data, I think it was Lobo's point, it may have been Alex's point, whose data are we talking about? Who gets to determine what impact looks like? So I think it's really important to broaden our understanding of trust. When we think about things we trust institutions, we trust people, we trust so many different aspects of our life. There are many aspects of our life where we experience trust. Very rarely is it lobbing something in the direction of the counterparty and walking away. So invite the rejoining of rigor to the conversation and asking ourselves a question fundamentally of who gets to have a decision of what that rigor looks like. I think the problem is what we're all reacting to, where the problem is big philanthropy in a particular way, and Bridgespan contributed to this in some ways in the early days, big philanthropy having a theory of change and having a uniform set of expectations across a diverse portfolio of actors and imposing those expectations on that diverse set of actors, as opposed to centering the experiences of those actors, centering the experiences of the communities those actors are serving, and surfacing up from that end of the sort of the chain of activity what the best thing to measure and act on is. The other thing that I think, having said that, and the recognition of the role of power in that comment, there are also some really cool things. This is not quite answering a question, but I'll just take a moment. There's some really cool things that have emerged in the trust-based philanthropy world. So I encourage you all to take a look at the Center for Effective Philanthropy and their analysis of the McKinsey Scott grants 1 year in. What the research shows is that there are these incredible organizational effects on the recipients and the leadership effects on the recipients. And Bridgespan actually did a little bit of research on a set of folks who received large unrestricted funds from the Balmer Group. In 2017, we looked at them just last year, 5 years later. So these folks received large unrestricted funds. It was a version of windfall philanthropy, so they got a phone call and they were told they received, 21 organizations were told they would receive this funding. The only difference is that they were told that it would be spread out over 5 years, and there were very minimal reporting requirements, as I understand it. And when our team checked in with 18 of the 21 recipients, we learned these wonderful things that were kind of resonant with some of the comments we heard earlier today. So we heard that basically 3 things happened for these organizations. Number one, these organizations who had been starved for resources all this time were able to invest, 90% of them invested in foundational capabilities, IT, measurement and learning, fundraising. So one thing we learned immediately is like, oh, people act like there's tech debt. We talk about tech debt in the Valley here. This is like operational debt. All nonprofits, I would argue, pretty much 99% of the world carry operational debt. And once they receive funding in a trust-based mode, they're able to fund the foundational capabilities. The second thing, which I think is most fascinating, is that the nonprofit leadership and their teams had an emotional response, where the way one leader described it is they went from a scarcity mentality to an abundance mentality. And instead of playing defense all the time and worrying about having to switch the lights off, they saw opportunities and were able to seize them. And that, for anyone who's had the experience of scarcity, that is a profound shift in mindset. And the last thing is they imposed rigor. They actually chose themselves to do planning or to do succession planning, to do a whole bunch of things to steward those resources well. And the reason I wanted to raise rigor, and then I'll wrap, is that some of this measurement and learning conversation is a conversation purely of power, where the funder feels, in my experience, that absent their attention, the nonprofit leader is not going to impose rigor, that the nonprofit leader is not going to do. And I've now been at Bridgespan for 15 years, had the pleasure of working with dozens of nonprofit leaders. I've never met a nonprofit leader who doesn't want to have impact and want to demonstrate that. So the imposition of rigor in a trust-based philanthropic model, I think, and frame, is something we should take comfort in, because I think it does. It is something that the early data suggests does occur.
Thanks, Rohit. And I'm just constantly thinking about, from wearing the hat of an NGO. I don't know if I call myself a leader as yet, but really, somebody who represents the civil society here. And the more I understand where, Bridgespan or your perspective for the trust-based philanthropy comes in, my questioning and my reasoning constantly takes me back. And thank you for being so humble about saying that Bridgespan contributed to, these pieces in the beginning, because not a lot of times we also have the humility of acceptance, because the road to hell was also paved with good intentions, right? Not always do we have the humility as a sector, from the NGO side, from the funder side, right? Where we accept these pieces. So thank you for doing that. That brings me to you, Paige. At school and otherwise, we've been constantly looking at learning. So there was MNE, or monitoring, and first there were metrics, then comes along monitoring and evaluation, then came along MEL, monitoring, evaluation, learning. Just a couple of months back, I learned it's MEAL, monitoring, evaluation, assessments, and learning, or something. So the lexicons are evolving at a speed and a pace faster than, it's not that NGOs are stupid or dumb to not get it, right? But there is so much of, our languages may be different, right? But we get it, because if not for us, who wants to see the impact of the work that we are trying to do? It's the stuff that doesn't let us sleep, right? It's the stuff that makes us question. So for example, this little kid, again, 10, 11, father abandoned the mom. I don't want to make it sound corny, but that's the truth. So if it sounds corny, deal with it, right? The father abandoned the mom was pregnant, delivered a baby, and this 10-year-old, because she delivered her brother and saw the mucus and the blood and all of that and the trauma that comes with it, a lot of times, again, the number of home visits increase, the psychosocial counseling piece and the psychosocial health first aid pieces, in the mental health well-being part of it increase. And a lot of times, just 2 weeks back, one of my auditors, one of the funders' auditors comes and says, ye rubber or ye pencil or ye sharpener, kis bacche ko gaya hai, which basically means where the breakdown of the stationery of the rubber and the sharpener and the color pencils have gone in. The fact that we have a child protection policy, which is another form of evaluation and learning, we haven't been able to convince those guys as yet. And this is when we say we've been doing this work for 14 years. So Paige, how does SCOLE look at it? Or how do you look at it as an expert in the field, right? Where there's a conversation about learning and assessments, but how do you really bring the funder and the NGO to really see the merit of doing learning piece together and building it participatorily?
That is such an important question. Thank you. Thank you so much for asking it, and thank you all for having me. So excited to be here. So from SCOLE's perspective, what we are really trying to do more and more is leaning into the L, leaning into the learning piece, and moving away from the idea of we have to evaluate, we have to meet a certain set of metrics. And so I thought a good story to tell actually is right now we're in the midst of, we're about to launch our annual reporting process. And I thought it could be illustrative to share some of what that looks like with you all. And so we work with all of our grantee partners to just once a year touch base formally and to say, how are things going? How are things going for you? What are the things you're excited about? Like what's gone well over the past year? What are the challenges you've been seeing? And there are two really important pieces in there for me. The first one is we're not asking for a certain report full of has to be the structure of it. You have to have X metrics. We need to see all the research. We need to see like RCTs. We're not interested in that. We want to know, how do you tell your story? And how do you determine what success looks like? Because we know that we're not the experts in your field. You're the experts. We want to hear how you're talking about it and how you judge success to be. And the other thing that I think is really important is being able to say there are different ways of knowing things. And there is like the data and the analytics side of things, and everyone loves to be able to say, oh, we saw an X percentage increase every quarter for this thing. And especially when we're talking about these huge systemic problems, you can't do that. You can't say, so has your justice and equity increased 5% last quarter? Like, no, that's not something that you can do. And so we want to hear from grantees, like, how do you think about it? Or are there stories that you can tell? We do a lot of narrative change work. And so thinking about, how do you think about whether you're actually shifting narratives? And sometimes you can measure perception change over time if you have lots of money and lots of time and lots of patience, but sometimes you have to look for those indicators as well. And just something that we're spending a lot of time thinking about at Skoll is how can we be even more open to learning about that. And I think the other piece that's really important when we're talking about the learning relationship is we don't just want our grantee partners telling us what they're learning. We want to find a way to make sure that they're having that conversation amongst themselves, that we're not just extracting learnings, but we're sharing that back with the field. And that's such an important thing. That's something that we're still spending a lot of time thinking about. What are the best ways to do this? How can we share? How can we bring people together so the learnings can increase and the work can be done even better going forward? So
We'll try to do all of that with 5% admin costs one day. And hence, as much as we try and understand, from the nonprofit side of things, we try and understand the need for, and I think more than us, it's really coming from the funder side of things, and we appreciate that, and I spotlight that from the civil society side to the funders in the room and elsewhere, that when conversations on trust-based, multi-grant, philanthropy, sort of multi-year grant, and philanthropy based in feminist justice principles kind of comes alive, we have seen it. We have lived on the other edge of the table, and we are beginning to look at what a multi-year grant kind of feels like, but like Paige really, rightly kind of spotlighted. It's also, even a longitudinal study that just happened, that just lasts 2 years. We're not even looking at a 16-year-old, 16-year study. A 2-year study. How many of the people sitting in the room will fund a data-backed study like that? Right? And to what Ria said in the morning, it's not innovation as in a software tech product that you're building in a community, but just a newer lens of which should not change every year. If it's gender today, should not be. Climate tomorrow should not be. It's an intersectionality that exists as a layer across and through, right? And that brings me to the last question, which I open up to everyone. What should NGOs do? And I don't speak for the ones that can do a lot of RCTs. I speak for the ones who are completely on the ground, still figuring out what that budget from 3 crores to 5 crores would look like, INR. I'm still considering organizations which have lived for 10 years, have proven their proof of concept, have figured out, failed, fallen 7 times, gotten up 8th. How do those organizations which are on that scaling or the growth journey look at M&E from an anecdotal piece and a big data piece in a way that will really help them scale their work, whatever that work may be? Starting from Rohit and then proceeding in this order.
Yeah, I have a colleague who I've worked with for 15 years we think that NGOs should band together and unionize. So that's honestly where my head went first. It's very hard in a philanthropic ecosystem for NGOs of the size you're describing to exercise power and influence unless they're part of a collective. So I wouldn't want to put the burden, frankly, on the folks who are subject to a power imbalance in a system. I think the reform does start with philanthropy because that's where the power resides. So I think you have to do, if you're solving a problem, you have to do a critical analysis and see how does power flow and where do you need to actually apply that analysis and apply the change. I think there are tremendous opportunities for philanthropists to just widen the lens of what they do. And I think this room, I mean, trust-based philanthropy is a phrase, it's existed in many communities for a long, long time. Let's not pretend that that's not true. And it's a phrase in rooms like this that's only come up in the last 3, 4 years, 5 years. So the folks in this room are at the vanguard, actually, of the formal philanthropy movement. And so there's an opportunity to lean into this moment to sort of experiment with how you share and seed power in an M&E conversation. There's a great piece done by, I think Shadi Salehi is one of the co-authors from the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project. I forget the name of her co-author, talking about reimagining learning in a trust-based world. And the learning around long-term impact, which is what we've been talking about mostly on this panel, is just one element of the learning. The invitation is for funders to think about long-term impact, but again, with multi-year horizons, asking the folks most proximate for what's most useful in measuring impact. But also for the same philanthropists to engage in learning for accountability, which is asking yourself, getting anonymous information from your grantees about how you're doing in terms of amplifying your trust. And it's also learning for decision making, which is getting concrete data on whether or not the choices you're making are actually resulting in better outcomes for your grantees. So there's an invitation, I think, I guess, so the short answer, just to summarize this, is I think the power, you have to go do the power analysis and hold folks accountable for changing their behaviors on the philanthropy end. We have many great examples in the room today. We've heard great stories around that and great experiences. There's more to be done. And then really nudge philanthropists to think beyond the impact piece to more about the accountability and decision making. How do we, when we expand the learning lens to philanthropic practices to amplify the results, what do we come up with? And I think the exciting part is we're in the early part of that conversation. At least from where I'm sitting, it's the relatively early part of the conversation. So everyone in this room gets to be co-creator of that journey. Having said that, there are others like Thousand Currents who's here and who've been doing work like this for a long, long time. So it's not just a total vacuum. There are lots of bright spots and people to learn from.
Sure. So we're in the Valley. And in the Valley, people who are venture capitalists would evaluate a startup very differently from if you were investing in public equities. If we can bring that differentiated mindset to investing in companies, what do we learn from that for nonprofit investment? I use the word investment because these are investments. It's an investment in an organization's future. So when we look at philanthropy, I look for what I call surrogate indicators. If it's a small organization, it's a newer organization, they're not going to have the fancy $1 million RCTs and tons of data and stuff like that. So I might want to spend a lot of time with a founder, understand their personal story, their journey, resilience, ups, downs, stuff like that. Spend time with a couple of their senior leaders. How long have you been with the organization? What keeps you ticking, right? What keeps you up at night? Look at who their donors and advisors are. How long have they stuck with the organization? Maybe ask to speak with one of them just to understand backstory, context, what has worked, what has not worked. Sit down with the organization, as we spoke earlier, and say, how would you define impact? And try and understand their way of thinking about the problem and problem solving, because it's as much about understanding how they think about it. Look at their history of execution, right? So I am a strategy consultant, but I will admit that strategy is not worth the paper it's written on if you can't execute. So I might want to spend some time asking, what were your 3 priorities last year? Where did you end up on those? How was execution? What came in your way? So just try and understand, do they have the execution muscle? Maybe there's some basic housekeeping around finances, governance, and stuff like that. Very important, visit the program. Spend time in the community and see what relationships that organization has with program participants and beneficiaries. All of this takes a ton of time. But time is the essence of a trust-based relationship. I mean, we would do that in real-life relationships, so you need the time to make that happen. So there's no easy way around it, but that's how I would look at it. Now, of course, that's also a big ask of the nonprofit, especially if it's a small one. So there has to be a materiality threshold to that organization wanting to invest that time in you, which then takes me to multi-year funding. If both parties are putting in that much time to building a trust-based relationship, it's a no-brainer that multi-year funding has to be a part of this conversation. I will end with one thought. I was at a philanthropy forum last week, and there was a lot of talk about risk-taking and how do you de-risk. And this person said this line, which just stayed with me. She said, the problem with philanthropy is we're all trying to bet on a sure thing. That is the problem. We're all trying to bet on a sure thing. And really, is it that much risk when you're investing in a person who has risked everything in their life to achieve this goal? And so I loved that line. And then, of course, I became a pragmatist again and said, how do we operationalize it? So again, it's kind of trying to figure out that balancing game, but that line really stayed with me.
Yeah, that's amazing. The first thing that I was really thinking about when you shared that was just the longer term viewpoints. And I think that's such an important thing, this idea of having long-term relationships, the trust-based relationships, and knowing that you're in it for the long haul. And I think that's a really important part of it, is like seeking to establish, both from the funder side and the grantee side, actual relationships about more than just a transaction. Because a lot of the time, the impact that's trying to be had is you want to help as many children as possible, you want to educate as many people as possible, whatever your metric might be. But over the long term, what you're really trying to do is change attitudes, change the system, change the way that people think about themselves, think about their communities. And I think that's something that's really important, and that we like to think about a lot at Skoll, is that we can see these signals of progress. Maybe you've worked with X number of children this year, which shows that you're establishing those relationships in the community, but what you actually are doing over the long term is setting this infrastructure for yourself, setting this baseline. And so I think I would encourage grantees and nonprofits as well to rethink about it in terms of not only what are you doing right now, but how is this setting you up to have stronger relationships with local governments, with other funders, with other nonprofits, because that's another really important part of the story and the impact that you're having, is to establish yourself. And so I think that's really important. One other thing I would say is, this doesn't get talked about enough, but it's okay for things to not work. And it's important to be able, from the funder side in particular, to be able to say, like, oh my gosh, a global pandemic hit, so of course your numbers weren't what you thought they were going to be. You want to be able to say, like, wow, this system is changing a lot. Maybe there's a new government in place, maybe there's been some other major change, and that's okay. Have you learned from it? Are there things that we can share with others that we can then take this into consideration? Not necessarily the next time the global pandemic hits, but that too maybe. And just coming really back to the L side of things and to the learning. And I think that those are the best kind of funder partners that you can have as well, the ones who want to be part of that with you and close to those problems and continue to learn and to push and not expect perfection. So.
Thank you for saying that, Paige, because, and I would not leave you there at governments being changed and philanthropy doing or having the burden now to do a lot more, because systems change will not come without systems accountability, right? Or asking, why should it just be the burden of NGOs or civil society, for advocacies and policy change, and why shouldn't the philanthropy stand up? I understand it's not going to be easy. We get that. NGOs see that. We get that. How do we make philanthropy more courageous? How do we make philanthropy, M&E aside, right? You guys probably have better frameworks than NGOs that we can learn from, absolutely. But the courage that we have takes some from us as NGOs. We always constantly hear what NGOs can learn from Coca-Cola. What would really make the philanthropy or the funder or the the stakeholder with power, as Rohit rightly said, right? what would it make that side for to take a little bit of courage from the nonprofit side of things and looking at scale and M&E and all of that, and funding the front lines. The conversation since morning has kind of, I think, sort of, if I dare say, you know, has been around this theme of going more grassroots, going where it matters, right? Navchettas, Deepa. How do we really go back and fund the front lines? Let's not be scared of doing that because it involves, you know, a lot of work. Bhavik, it will involve a lot of work. Let's do that work. We will support you because it's only in our favor to kind of take that impact in a crazy, amazing way at the level of the communities, right? But one thing that I think a lot of philanthropy should take away from NGOs, and with that I'll close, Vrinda, maybe open it up for questions if there's time, but also Hindi में बोलते हैं, and I'll also translate that for sure. ये दुनिया तुम्हें भागना सिखाएगी, तुम ठहरना सीख जाना. These, and Shri was saying it so beautifully in the morning that these problems have existed 100 years back. They will probably in all its entirety exist 100 years hence. It's not that you and I are fools, right? We are trying to solve a problem or a host of insane problems. But ye duniya tumhe bhagna sikhayegi with scale and all of that. This world is going to make you run and rush, but learn to take a pause, reflect, do the L with the M and E, and maybe we'll reach a common middle path. So if there are questions, one or two, happy to take them, Rinda, if it's time. And you can pinpoint your questions to anyone on the panel. Wow, we really left a mark, right?
Absolutely. You've answered every question on M&E.
I just have one simple question. Again, I represent Ekal Vidyalaya, which is basically we have established several 80,000 plus schools in India. We can certainly measure impact, but what we have learned over the process is it's a slow process. You have to accept the system as it is because we are in deep rural villages where there is a lot of culture, everything plays into it. So you can't just have a financial goal saying that this is the speed at which we want to reach because it may fail. So over the last 10 years, what we have realized is let's accept the reality, build something, make sure that that is scalable, and then start moving forward. Always, as a nonprofit, we also have this issue, like you rightly mentioned, we want to keep our overhead as low as possible. And how do you build these compromises into, especially from a donor's perspective, because they want to see results quickly. And we are able to show everything that we can do, but still the expectation is there. How do you balance that?
One of my colleagues has this great phrase saying, if you choosing your nonprofit to support on the basis of their overhead, their low overhead, is like picking an airline based on who spends the least amount of money on maintenance. And I think that's fundamentally true. I think the sector is having an awakening around that. There's many movements to actually expand that funding. The closest thing, I mean, I know you've had many conversations with funders. The simple truth is there's a thing in the for-profit world called SG&A, and I invite any funder who has a business background to explain why they have any money in SG&A if they're expecting an overhead of 10 or 15%. That's sort of like one observation. The second observation is a recognition that flat overheads are just weird because different nonprofits have different models. And so a research institution is going to have a different overhead than a delivery institution like an Ekal or like a Akshapatra or something like that. So I think there's more education to be done, and it's going to be this constant battle around recognizing the importance of healthy overhead. I was also turning you over, if you're interested, we're happy to talk, but there's also a whole bunch of resources around the starvation cycle, that's the frame that we use in the US sometimes with nonprofits, that can be convincing, well, we think can be convincing to donors. So there's good data to suggest that underfunding nonprofits is actually a challenge to impact.
I'd just like to piggyback on that. I think organizations like Dasra could play a pivotal role on educating philanthropy. Education is the word you used, and I completely agree with that. M&E is hard, period. And M&E, when it comes to solving for complex problems of the kinds we are talking about, often involve an ecosystem of things to do. You are working on the supply side, demand side, government, parents, schools, and then you have donors who want you to scale to 1 million kids before you figure out how to do the first 100,000. They only make it harder. So there is a good component of donor education here. SG&A, absolutely, and since we're talking MLE, I don't think that should be an overhead. I personally think it should be a line spend. Like in the context of schools, like Ekal School, I don't know how you run a school without having data, right? And so there is a lot of donor education that needs to happen. And there is just no two ways about it, because you can't do this kind of work in the dark and, nickel diming your way through it. You just can't.
And I think all the NGO leaders should also be unapologetic, unabashed on social media and talk about this, because unless that, nothing's much going to change. So with that, we close the panel. Thank you for your time and patience with us.